I'm delighted to introduce now our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Alex Wonhas. Alex is Executive Director, Energy and Resources at CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency. He has responsibility for 650 researchers who work with industry to provide science and technology solutions for the energy and resources sectors to enhance their productivity, competitiveness and environmental sustainability. Earlier in his career, Alex was a consultant at McKinsey, where he co-authored the carbon abatement cost curves for Australia, which many of you may be familiar with. Please welcome Dr. Alex Wonhas to speak on More from Less, Navigating the Transition.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a really great pleasure and privilege to be here this morning and speak about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I think a topic that is absolutely relevant for Australia as a nation, for this region, and frankly, for this planet. I think in the 21st century, one of the, if not the most important challenge we have to solve is how can we bring prosperity to an ever-growing population of our planet and do that in a sustainable way. The way we are achieving this challenge will ultimately determine whether we will end up on the right-hand side of this picture, where certainly I would love to be, or whether we will be on the left-hand side of this picture, which represents an unsustainable development pathway that I presume no one wants to achieve. Now, I have to disappoint you because I will not be able to tell you what exact pathway we need to take to get there. But what I want to share with you is 3 things that I believe will really matter to find that pathway. And although I wasn't sitting next to Buzz on the plane, I did not make a marriage proposal, but actually the 3 things that I had in my mind are curiously similar to what Buzz already mentioned this morning. For me, it will be essential for us to really understand the potential pathways and their implications that we can take. That's really what you refer to as knowing. Secondly, it will be very important to develop the mechanisms that direct the very significant investment that we are going to make into those areas that drive towards a prosperous and sustainable future. That's, I think, what you refer to as wanting. And then lastly, coming from a science organization, I think innovation will be really critical to develop the solutions, if they don't exist yet, and many, by the way, already exist, to enable us to take this pathway. And that's, I think, what, Beth, you refer to as being able. So quite interestingly, similarities. Now, I will tell you this from the vantage point of an R&D organization who is involved in actually all of these 3 areas. In the work that we do actually try to map out future pathways. We are at times involved in creating markets or other mechanisms largely through the provision of the right data sets. And then probably in the mainstay of our work, trying to develop solutions that help us achieve this pathway. Now let me start off with one of the examples where we're actually trying to map out future pathways. There are just 3 of many examples. Actually, one is on the left-hand side, change in choice. We looked at how could the future of our electricity system evolve. And I actually brought this up because this came out of a previous cluster that Stuart actually led very ably, starting in, I think, 2009. And really mapped out how can we transform our electricity system to make it more productive, more sustainable, and frankly, more affordable. We're also doing work on climate change. So every 2 years, we are actually providing a snapshot of the latest understanding on climate change, in particular for Australia and this region, which is obviously a key driving force for the future development of the economy. But I wanted to actually pick the middle report, which is called Our Future World, because it really sets the context. We have brought together experts from Australia and all over the world to identify what are the 6 key megatrends that will shape the future in the 21st century. And here they are. Just quickly going through them. One is, I think we are facing a century where expectations will be greatly heightened, especially from the rapidly growing and expanding middle classes in this region, who want to enjoy the same standard of living that many people in the developed world already enjoy. Secondly, virtually here, we see an amazing trend towards digitalization and using virtual tools to basically connect the whole world. Thirdly, forever young. Not only are life expectancies growing all across the world, but also the expectations and ability of people to actually enjoy their life increases, which again increases more and more demand for resources. Next, the Silk Highway. As we know, the center of economic gravity is moving from Europe and the US into this region, and that's represented through the Silk Highway. But all of these have challenges. Next theme is going, gone. That reflects the significant environmental pressures that are a result of this very significant development, which then brings me to what I believe is probably one of the most important challenges that we need to solve, and the challenge that this conference is focusing on is how can we actually sustain this growth and achieve doing more with less input from resources. Now let's talk about resources. I find it often quite difficult to really understand and visualize what this massive growth means that we are going to face in the future. So I've given you a bit of a picture that really symbolizes it for me. So on the left-hand side, you have a picture of Shenzhen in 1982. And on the right-hand side is a picture of Shenzhen only 25 years later. And what a phenomenal change, complete urbanization of a previously very rural landscape in only 25 years. And this trend, if we expect the growth trajectories to continue, will continue. Just to, again, illustrate this, it's equivalent to building 3 cities of the size of Sydney in every year to meet the demands of the migration of the rural population to the cities in China alone. So the resources required to achieve that are absolutely immense. You can also express this in dollar terms, but again, that's where I really cannot fathom what it means to invest $19 trillion by 2030 to support this growth. But certainly what this graph shows you, especially the blue bars, that most of this investment will happen in this particular region. And that's why it will be so important to make sure that this investment is made in a sustainable way. And you can look at almost any metrics in the physical economy that tells you the same picture. So here's a metric from an area that's quite close to my heart, energy and resources. So that's energy demand. On the left-hand side, you see the energy demand in the OECD countries. It's effectively flat. So there's not much growth. But where the growth really is, it's in this region. Later on, Janet's actually going to talk about a great piece of work from the UNEP, and I will not steal your thunder, so I'll skip over that. All of this growth has its limitations, and we are running into some very significant challenges. So for instance, on the left-hand side, on the top, I've given you some of the impacts that this growth already had on biodiversity. On the left-hand side, land-based biodiversity, a decline of about 40% over the last 30 years. Similarly, marine-based biodiversity, a decline of about 20%. And as a result, we have started to protect more and more of our landmass and of our oceans to counteract this trend. We are also all very familiar to the vastly different trajectories we could take on greenhouse gas emissions. If we develop all of this growth in a carbon-intensive way, we might increase our temperatures by 6 degrees, which the scientific consensus is would be utterly unsustainable. But we have also seen many, many scenarios where we can actually achieve this growth and limit the increase in temperatures by 2 degrees. And I think, as Mary already referred to, all of this growth leads also to very significant pushback from local communities. Lock the Gate, people in Australia would be very familiar with, is a local movement against the development of, in this case, coal seam gas, which is one of the potential fuels that could drive this growth. And I think, as Mary outlined very eloquently, it is not necessarily a function of technology, but it's a function of engagement with communities, a function of application of the latest in technology to manage that growth in a sustainable way. So, what is needed to navigate this very significant challenge? As I said before, I think 3 things really matter. We need to get really good at understanding where the possible trajectories that we might choose will lead to. We need to understand that with a high spatial and temporal resolution. We need to understand the economics of it. We need to understand the biophysical implications, and we need to understand the social implications for these future trajectories. But that's not enough. We also then need to build markets or other mechanisms that help us to value the future that we want and maybe discourage investment into areas and pathways that we don't value. That will include creating new markets for things that are maybe not as valued at the moment as they should be, such as carbon, but also maybe such as things like biodiversity. And lastly, innovation will be absolutely critical to develop those solutions. So let me take these 3 things in turn. So firstly, around understanding. There's a really important story that certainly highlights for me the importance of understanding implications and then acting on it. So that's the story of the Goyder line in South Australia. So cast your mind back to the year 1865. It was about 30 years into the development of South Australia when the then Surveyor General George Goyder, Richard Goyder is someone else, surveyed the country to identify where is suitable land for agriculture. And he noted a quite distinct difference between the vegetation north, which was characterized by saltbush, and south, which was characterized by mallee. And he suggested at the time agricultural land should be done in the southern part, in the mallee land, because that would be sustainable. Now, unfortunately, 1865 was also a bumper year for rain. So the country north of the Goyder line looked very lush. So many people settled there. But in the end, climate patterns returned to their normal. And what you see on this photo is the result of that. There were many communities that created their new livelihood in a completely unsustainable area. And ultimately, those communities decayed. So I think our challenge will be not only to find those new Goyder lines in the future, but then also to engage with communities to understand and convince them of the right pathway. So we do that in many ways. I'll just give you one example of that, and that's some work that we've done in the Mekong region, also in Southeast Asia, that actually highlights often the complexity and interconnectedness of identifying those pathways. And that's a classic example is the energy, water, and food nexus. So when you look at that, water is obviously absolutely critical because by using water resources and irrigation, you can dramatically increase food production and you can increase the value of food production. if you have food production, you can actually make a choice whether you produce food or you can actually produce energy crops. And if you have energy, again, you can provide water. You can desalinate and provide safe drinking water, or you can transport water from regions where you have maybe more or less. But the circle also goes in the other way. If you have water, that's again critical for the production of energy, either directly, say for instance through hydropower, but it's also a vital input for a lot of thermal power stations. And if you have energy, it's again a vital input for your agricultural industry, either through fertilizer production or for just simply running the energy inputs for the farm system. So it's a very complicated and interconnected system that we need to understand and that we need to manage. It's a very complicated system. And I think it's also quite important that we understand those kind of systems at a very local level. Because in particular, when you look at water, due to its low value, it's actually very hard to transport it. So therefore, having excess water in one region might not mean much for another area. Thirdly, it's a very non-linear system. Again, think back at the Goiter line. If you cross that threshold, you're actually moving into an unsustainable way, and that can sometimes happen in a very quick way, in a way that you don't observe. Fourthly, one of the challenges that we are facing today is that a lot of these thresholds are evolving. Again, take climate change as an example. Our rainfall patterns are changing, and we need to take that into account as we try to chart and map our future trajectories. And especially for wealthy countries such as Australia, often those thresholds and tipping points are hidden because we are so wealthy that we can often afford to just pay a bit more money to overcome those challenges in the short term. But as many examples in history show, these are short-term solutions, and people will not be able or willing to pay necessarily to overcome those challenges. So it's absolutely critical to understand. Now let me give you an example of the second really key driver that I think we need to focus on, and that's markets. Again, as Buzz highlighted, Australia is actually one of the driest continents, and in the last decade it was hit by a phenomenal, we call it, millennium drought. One of the reasons that enabled us to manage this drought in an effective way was actually a very effective water market. So at the height of the drought, water use from irrigation actually had to decrease by 70%. That's a very significant decrease. But at the same time, the value from agricultural output in these regions only decreased by 20%. Why was that the case? Because again, it was the market that actually helped us to shift production into those areas that use less water. In this case, for instance, cereal, which you see has a much lower water intensity, but still a significant value, and reduce production in other areas such as cotton, which is very water intensive and therefore not very suitable. Now, this is a market for a very established commodity, but we will also have to create new markets. Now, here's an example from a work that we are hopefully publishing in the next couple of months, which is called the Australian National Outlook, where we looked at a range of different scenarios for the future of Australia. And as part of this work, we actually explored the implication of what it could mean for Australia to create a new market for land-based carbon abatement, but also for biodiversity payments. And the effect of such a market in especially a climate-constrained future would be quite stark. It could increase the national income by 2%. It could increase the income of landholders by 11%, so quite significant. It could if it's well designed, increase native vegetation cover by 16%, and at the same time almost sequester cumulatively 10 gigatons of carbon. So I think finding those mechanisms and markets that will direct investment into the areas where they can derive sustainable benefits, that will be essential. Now let me come to the last point, which is really around innovation. Once we understand the trajectory, once we have the right incentives and mechanisms in place, we then need the solutions that really drive our economy. Traditionally, especially in a country like Australia, I think industry is focusing on what I would call the traditional value chain and how we can improve productivity across this traditional value chain. Now that's important, and I'll give you a couple of examples of some of the exciting things of improvement of efficiency that are possible in this space. But as I'll point out in a minute, that's probably not enough to achieve really the sustainability and circular economy aspirations that we have. So take the resources space. Obviously, all of this growth that I've outlined at the beginning of my talk, that will need to be fueled by resources that need to be found. Now, that task is getting ever more challenging. In Australia, for example, 80% of the continent is actually covered, which makes it much more difficult to actually find those new resource deposits that are not outcropping at this point in time. But again, innovation and technology can actually help us to find the most prospective deposits. For example, we have developed some technology that is now deployed in all of the state service that actually takes digital images of every single drill core that has ever been drilled in this continent. That gives you an amazing amount of data that is very rich to analyze. You can combine that with new analytical techniques to actually explore and find new resources. So one that I find quite fascinating is we have developed a technique where we can analyze eucalyptus leaves. And this is important because the roots of the eucalyptus go about 30 meters into the ground, but by analyzing the leaves, we know what is actually underneath. And that will help us to find where those resources are undercover. Then combining that with state-of-the-art physical and geochemical models gives us a completely new state-of-the-art understanding of where those resources are. So we can find those resources using those techniques. We can also become more productive. Here's an example of a technology which is called Guardian Mentor, which allows a remote operator in a mine to be connected to an expert, which is maybe based anywhere, frankly. And the expert can then guide the remote operator to fix a piece of equipment much faster than it would otherwise be possible to, which would require to fly the expert to this location. There's also some amazing technologies that is developed with sensors. Here's an example of a sensor we've developed actually together with Vale that goes on bees that detects their breeding patterns and their scanning patterns. Now with those sensors, we can get a completely new understanding of, for example, the environmental impacts that a lot of these resource developments will have. But I would argue this is all run-of-the-mill normal improvements to existing value chains. I think what we really need to do to solve the challenge of creating a truly circular economy, we have to invent new business models and new value chains. And I might conclude with just one example that we have been working on, and I think that's also a focus of the Wealth from Waste cluster, is take steel production. Obviously, think back to one of those pictures I showed you from Shenzhen. The amount of steel that goes into that is phenomenal. Traditionally, that steel is produced from iron ore and coking coal. But we have been working on finding ways of actually changing that dynamics. So you can actually use biochar, which again Australia has a phenomenal landmass to produce that biochar, and use it to reduce the iron ore in a much more sustainable way. But then not stop there, but actually think much more circular about the use of the waste products from the steel production process, which is the slag. And we're very pleased that I think 2 months ago we actually commercialized a new dry slag granulation technology where you take the slag that's coming out of the steel making process, put it on a highly rotating disc that creates just tiny little droplets of granular material that can be then used as aggregate in, for instance, the cement making process. The impact of a technology like that, just as an example, could be immense. It saves significant amount of water. So if that technology was deployed into all steel making in China, it would save about a quarter of the water consumption of a large city like Melbourne, and it would save about 10% of the equivalent of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And that's just one of many technologies that can be developed. So, in conclusion, I think it is possible to grow our economy in a sustainable and prosperous way as long as we focus on three things. Let's make sure we are really developing the capability to understand the possible trajectories that we can heading into. Second, we put the market and other mechanisms in place to guide our investment. And thirdly, let's keep on working on solutions that will enable us to grow in a sustainable way. Thank you.